You've run into some unique characters. You've run into Abba Schuster. You've run into Gimple the Fool. You've run into Elka. And the question is, where does Singer get his characters? Well, if you look on the screen, you get some idea. No, we don't need that. Thank you. All right, we have to put this back on. Okay, we're almost there. Singer says, I don't invent characters because the Almighty has already invented millions and billions of them. Humanity may become 1,000,000 years old, and I'm sure that in all this time there will not be two people who are really alike. Experts at fingerprints do not create fingerprints. They learn how to read them. In the same way, the writer reads human characters. Why does he use female characters? He says, I use the female narrator in many of my stories because among the Yiddish-speaking people, the storytellers were either the Hasidim or the old women. They used to sit there on the porches of their houses and tell stories. And since they were not inhibited by special doubts, they would just say whatever they had to say in their own way. And they said it sometimes in a very picturesque and remarkable manner. By the way, Robert Burns says he learns the folk tales of his family from an old maid at whose feet he used to sit when she told stories. And John Weidman, the modern black writer, the writer of the Urban Ghetto, says he heard stories from an old aunt who used to tell him the stories of his family. Where does he get the dialogue? Singer says, I usually use the monologue of some chassid or of some old woman. Of course, in my stories, I also use monologues of people who come to ask advice from me. I often let people tell their stories in their own way, instead of my sitting there and telling their stories in my voice. It's both very convenient and very fruitful to let people tell their own stories, and that is when you hear the demons talking, when you hear Gimple talking, you get a lilt in the voice, you get a Yiddish lilt that comes out of the Eastern European tradition, but it's the voice of the characters talking. Now, I had mentioned earlier before the Kabbalistic background. We're going to be looking at several stories today that do draw from a Kabbalistic tradition. Now, Kabbalah is not a book. Kabbalah is the whole tradition, the whole matrix of a belief that is beyond the essential pages of the Bible itself. It's a post-Mosaic tradition, and Kabbalah really developed in the 13th century of mystical concepts studied in southern France and Spain since the 12th century. So that's from around 1149 through about 1215 or 1315. One of the major mystics is a man by the name of Isaac Luria, who lived from 1534 to 1572. He is the founder of a mystical school in Sfad. He was in the city of Sfad in 1569, which is in the south, which is in the north of Israel, and today is an art colony and also a site of major schools, but it's the source and the foundation of the Hasidic movement. Another Kabbalist is a man by the name of Chaim Vital, who used Luria's teachings, and he influenced Israel Sarek, who is an Italian Kabbalist. If you want to keep Sarek probably influenced Paracelsus in the 17th century. Paracelsus influenced Blake in the 18th century. Blake influenced Yeats in the 20th century. So we see these Kabbalistic movements going on. Now, the mystical book of Kabbalah is called the Zohar. It's the source of mystical teaching since the 14th century. It's a mystical commentary on parts of the Bible, and it seems to have been derived, at least the historians claim it was derived, from the 2nd century rabbis, among whom was a scholar by the name of Simon Bar Yochai. One of the books, the Raya Mechemana, deals with the Kabbalistic interpretation of commandments and prohibitions. How do you interpret the commandments in the Bible? How do you interpret prohibitions? And we find commandments and prohibitions both celebrated in Singer's stories. You also have a section of the Zohar on physiognomy and chiromancy, and this, of course, has the shapes of the body and parts of the body. What is the Zohar, this mystical book from the 13th century? It is a mix of theosophic theology, mystical psychology, anthropology, myth, and poetry. I think if we put it on the screen a little longer, we'll have a chance to see it. Thank you. There are Gnostic doctrines from early church fathers or religious fathers, mystical traditions, theurgic speculations, as dealing with the magic of theology, popular superstitions, and mythological motifs, along with Neoplatonic and Aristotelian philosophic theories of the nature of the cosmos. Now you may say, well, that's about everything anyone could possibly know. It certainly would cover everything we learn in our honors program in that very special literature studied quite well in that program. The question of the Zohar is the relationship between the infinite God and the finite world. And the main term there is Ein Sof. Sof means end. Ein means no. Ein Sof means there's no end. Therefore, the inscrutable mystery of the Godhead is what is infinite. Now, there are 10 sfirot, 10 divine movements. I just want to look at them briefly. The Keter is the crown, the first cause. And what you're really looking at is a body. The mind is the Keter, the head is the Keter, and you move down to the foundation, which is the groin area, which is called the Yesod. So what you're doing is looking at the shape of a human being. The Keter is the crown, and it's male and female. The first cause of all things is recognized in Kabbalah to be male and female together. They are a unity, not separations. Chachma is wisdom. The word Chacham means wise, and man is the father, the builder. Binah is another concept of the Sefirot. Binah leads to intelligence and mercy. Chesed, the fourth word, is mercy or greatness. Tiferet is beauty. The concept of beauty is embraced in the nature of divine evolution. Netzach is victory. This is power, glory. And Chod is glory, the next element. The Yesod is the foundation. And the Malkut is kingdom. Everything is ultimately leading to the kingdom of heaven. And there are angels. I'm going to just run through the names of the angels because these angels also appear in the stories of Isaac Bashevis Singer. Metatron, Raziel, Safkiel, Tzadkiel, Samuel, Michael, Haniel, Raphael, Gabriel, Sandalphon, who represents the Messiah. Now, you may say, where do people get these names? They're in the text. They're understood. This is where angelology and demonology comes from. But just as you have angels, you also have the demons. And the names of demons also appear. And, of course, this is the literature that Isaac Bashevis Singer is drawing from in his mythology and his folklore. Thomel are the doubles of God. You have Satan and Moloch. Milton has Satan and Moloch in Paradise Lost. Milton understood Kabbalistic origins. And there is a book on Milton's rabbinical readings, which suggests that he knew a great deal about the Zohar, Kabbalah, and early literature. Now these demons, Chagdeel is represented by the placenta. Sathriel essentially deals with the concealment of God. These are people who stir problems. Gamkikoth is a disturber. Golub deals with burning and incendiarism. This is where you get the fiery hell, the fiery demons. The Torgorini are the wranglers. They just cause trouble amongst people. And of course in Singer you have a lot of people just causing trouble among people. Samiel represents embroilment. Gamliel represents the obscene. And Lilith is the demon of impurity. You know, Lilith is very, very dangerous in Jewish folklore. She disguises herself, and she tries to suck out the breath from newborn babies. So what you must do is, when you have given birth, you cover the mirrors in the child's room, because Lilith can come through the mirror and suck out the breath of the baby through the mirror. The only one who knows all of Lilith's unique and distinctive identities is Elijah, the prophet Elijah, this ubiquitous prophet that Ahab sought everywhere and couldn't find. So you leave a rocking chair in the child's room so Elijah can come in and sit and protect the child from the victimization of Lilith. These sources come in a rather sizable book. There are many books dealing with the Kabbalah. This is the Holy Kabbalah by Waite, published by University Books. Singer on Yiddish. He writes in Yiddish, and most of his work is translated from the Yiddish. Even one of the stories we're going to do today, Blood and Two, are translated from the Yiddish. Singer tells us that he read Dickens' Pickwick Papers as a youngster in Hebrew, that he read The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde in Hebrew. He read Tolstoy and Dostoevsky in Hebrew, Polish, and German, but he read Shakespeare in Yiddish. That's what he learned about literature. And Singer, describing himself as a Jewish writer, says, "To be a Jewish writer, you need to know more than just the Jewish people in the United States or Chicago. It is necessary to know also more about the tradition. I would say that to be really called a Jewish writer, you have to know Hebrew, you have to know Aramaic, you have to know the Talmud, which is the interpretation of the Bible, and history. In other words, it's not enough to know your hero. You must know the hero's father and grandfather and what they thought and how they behaved." And he says in one of his interviews, writers like Philip Roth and others know only one dimension. Now, Roth is a great writer, so I'm not going to diminish his reputation, but that's what Singer says. Singer says the Yiddish tradition, in my mind, is a tradition of sentimentality and of social justice. He says himself, "I am not a sentimental person by nature. By sentimental, I mean really sentimental. Let's call it schmaltz, as it should be called. Neither is it my nature to fight for social justice, although I am for social justice. But since I'm a pessimist, and I believe that no matter what people are going to do, it will always be wrong, and there will never be justice in this world, I have, in my own way, given up. And because of this, I had to create my own kind of tradition." So he is a Yiddish writer, but he says that Yiddish writers are mostly sentimentalists, but he is not a sentimentalist. So we're going to see how much of a sentimentalist he is not with a discussion of the next story, Blood, by Miss West. And we'll move into that story now and get some insight into Singer's unsentimental reassertion of the assault on Jewish customs and Jewish traditions. Ms. West. You talk, and I'm going to be working something. Go
ahead. I just wanted to go over a few things that I found in Isaac Bashevis Singer's biography. Number one, I discovered a pseudonym, Warshawski. Now, I wasn't able to back that up with another source, but I thought I would mention it. He was the son of a pious rabbi who considered secular writing heretical and a more skeptical rationalist mother. He grew up in poor, overpopulated Jewish quarters of Warsaw. He was educated at Warsaw Rabbinical Seminary and began writing as a young man in Warsaw after World War I. His older brother, Israel Joshua Singer, was a writer, a well-known writer who immigrated to the United States. And Isaac moved to New York in 1935 to be near his brother, who he considered to be his mentor. He was a prolific writer. He wrote 12 books of short stories, 13 children's books, 3 collections, and 4 books of memoirs. The story we're going to talk about tonight, Blood, was published in Short Friday and Other Stories in 1964. Some of the major characters in this. Reb Falik. He marries Risha in his old age. His first wife, died. Both of the children by that first wife died young, and Reb Falik wanted another child. So he married her against the advice of his friends, and he was a very honest man in business, and he was called Ehrlichman, and that became part of his name. He owned a large estate near Leshkev. Risha Falik. She was 30 years younger than Reb Falik. She was widowed twice. She was considered a man-killer. She was a corpulent woman, very strong as a man. She had red hair, very green eyes, high bosom, and referred to as having childbearing hips. Reuben was a ritual slaughterer from a nearby village of Kralika. He was fat, he had a big stomach, a red neck, he was short, fleshy throat, he had pitch black hair on his cheeks and very dark, piercing eyes. This book is written in 6 parts. The first part, Reb Falik marries Risha. His friends warn him, don't do it, she's a man killer. And they feel that she killed her first 2 husbands. She had beaten her first husband with a stick. He died. Her second husband was paralyzed for several years. She refused to call a doctor. She never did. He died. So then, against the advice of his friends, he marries her anyway. Soon after the marriage, Risha starts to take charge of his estate. And she does a good job, actually. She handles the rentals. She handles the stock. She takes care of things. And then she takes Reb into Leshkev and has him sign all his property over to her. So at this time, she really takes over, and there's not much for him to do, and he retires from the running of his estate to a study house that he had on his property when there were, I believe, 10 Jewish men on the property. They could hold religious services there. So he retires there. He reads Psalms, and from time to time he dozes on the sofa in an adjoining room. Eventually, their longtime ritual slaughterer, Reb Dan, dies. Now, he was a relative, and what he did, he slaughtered a few chickens a week and not much else, but Reb Valak would have had to take care of him anyway, so he had him as the ritual slaughterer. So after he dies, Risha decides that they need a new ritual slaughterer, and she asks around and hears about Reuben. Now, Reuben is in a nearby village called Kralika, and his wife had died in childbirth. He runs a tavern, and the peasants drink there. So she orders one of the peasants to gather up some fowl and drive her or in the cart to Kralika so that she can see this Reuben. Well, when she gets there, he's not in his house, but she goes in the house, and she glances through the window, and she sees that he's in the yard with this barefooted woman, and he's going to slaughter a bird. And he slaughters the bird, and the bird kind of jumps around a little bit, the blood kind of splashes around a little bit, and he's playful with the woman. And she watches this. Then he notices that Risha's watching him from his own house. And his red face gets a little redder. So he's embarrassed at this point. Risha had the peasant set the sack on the ground by his feet, which I take it was not too formal. But since he was fooling around with this woman, she figured he wasn't too formal anyhow, and she did it. And then she asked if he would slaughter the birds for her. And he says, well, what would I do? Revive dead chickens, you know? Yes, of course he'd slaughter the birds. And then she tells him that her husband is very, very particular about kosher. And in order to demonstrate to her that he will do this properly, he takes the blue-bladed steel and draws it across his index finger. It's sort of a sexual feeling there for both of them, I think. Then Reuben promptly slaughters a yellow chicken. And after he slaughters the yellow chicken, he's ready for a white gander. Well, she tells him that the gander was a very tough bird, and he, picked on the other ones in the yard. And Reuben said, well, he wouldn't be tough very much longer. So Risha then asked, did he have no pity? And Reuben slaughtered the gander while she watched. And as she watched him slaughter the gander and the blood flow down over the white feathers, she bit her lip. And she paid him. He held her hand just a little bit, perhaps too long. And she asked if he would come to the estate to slaughter for her. And he said, yes, he would come if, in addition to paying him, she would send a cart for him. So that night, she goes home, and she has rather frightening but exciting dreams during the night. She felt the next morning a desire for Reuben. So she goes out a few days later, and she gathers up some chickens herself, puts them in the sack, and she hitches up the cart and takes them to Krog herself. And when she gets there, he's standing in the door as if he were waiting for her. And she's also in a hurry to get to him. So then he slaughters the first chicken, and as the blood flows out of the chicken, the two of them become quite excited, and he pushes her down on his bench bed, and although she protests that she's an honest woman, she's a married woman, he's a highwayman, he's a horrid person, she reciprocates. So in amorous play, she asks him to slaughter her. So symbolically, Reuben draws his fingers across her throat and slaughters her. So her words to him are, "You certainly killed me that time." And he says, "Well, you certainly killed me too." Then she decides that she just must have Reuben at the estate. But she can't justify bringing him to the estate because she, after all, only has a few chickens a week to slaughter. So what she does, she goes to Reb Phalik and tells him, the estate's not making any money. They're going to be ruined in a few years. What they need to do is pasture cattle. They can have a dairy. They can slaughter cattle. They can open up a butcher shop in Lishkeb and earn enough money that they won't go into bankruptcy and ruin. And although he protests that God has always provided, she finally convinces him that this is a thing to do. So then she goes into town and she tells the rabbi what she plans to do and the butchers, and that she plans to open up a butcher shop and sell her meat 2 cents a pound cheaper than the other butchers. So the rabbi, he puts a prohibition on her meat, and the other butchers are just incensed. But she does it. She has the poor on her side, and she opens it up, and it doesn't make money for a while, but eventually it does. And she brings Reuben to the estate. Well, from the very beginning, Risha was always present when Reuben slaughtered. And she watched the blood. She watched the slaughter. She enjoyed this. And the more she watched this, the more it became intertwined with carnal desire, to the point that she didn't know where the shedding of blood left off and the carnal desire began. They would make love amongst the slaughtered animals and the blood. So when it finally became profitable, she built a slaughtering shed, and she gave Reuben an apartment in the main house. So now they could really satisfy their desires. And he then became pampered by her. They both grew fat. Their bodies did. And he slaughtered only at night. He was like the man of the manor during the day. He'd walk around in a silk robe and silken slippers and just do nothing. You know, he'd go take a swim in the river. And she pampered him in this manner. Then at night, he would slaughter. Well, at night, she could go out and watch. All of the peasants were asleep. Oh, Reb Phalik, he went to bed early, so he wasn't around. And they only had an old man to assist him who was half blind and deaf, I believe. Now, Reb Phalik, he got a little suspicious about her familiarity with Reuben, but being an honest man, he gave him the benefit of the doubt. Then Risha did the unholiest thing. She talks Reuben into letting her slaughter. Well, she wasn't permitted to slaughter. She had not been trained in slaughtering. And if she slaughtered, then the meat became non-kosher. And the slaughterer took on the sins of any non-kosher, of any of the people that he supplied the meat to. If they ate this non-kosher meat, knowing or unknowing, they had sinned. He took on the responsibility for the sins. But she talks him into it anyhow. So then she begins to cheat. She's not just satisfied with the fact that she's now giving them non-kosher meat. She has to cheat. She sells tallow for kosher fat, and she fails to remove the sinews from the thighs of the cattle. Deceiving people becomes a powerful passion for her, as much as lechery and cruelty. And debauchery causes Risha and Reuben to age prematurely. They start to look really old. Their bodies swell up with fat. Their hearts are surrounded by fat. They can barely meet when they have their tryst. And most of the time now, they're passing their time in idle talk. But people begin to talk about Risha and Reuben and about the quality of her meat. And the butchers hearing this, they go to the rabbi, and they ask the rabbi to have an investigation. But the rabbi rebuffs this because he says they have no proof. No one has seen any of this, and that he won't call an investigation without it. So what the butchers do, they go out and they hire a ruffian as a spy. And he's a young ruffian, but he manages to get through the estate, past the fierce dog she has on the estate, and he looks through a crack in the slaughtering shed. Well, when he looks through the crack in the slaughtering shed, he sees Risha hobbling these animals, throwing them to the ground, slaughtering the animals, and then she and Reuben just throwing themselves in the midst of this slaughter and blood and making love. And even though he's a ruffian and he's not a very nice person, it terrifies him. So he rushes off and he goes to the rabbi, and he tells the rabbi what he saw. Now, at first, the rabbi is surprised and he calls the elders, but they just really don't believe this ruffian. They think that, you know, the butchers have gotten him to lie for them. But he rushes out and he swears on the Holy Scroll, and they believe him. And the town then learns that they have eaten non-kosher meat for years, and they become terrified. The women pull their hair, they cry, they beat their breast. The men, the butchers, go to Risha's shops and they beat up her butchers, her meat sellers. And a crowd forms and they decide they'll go to the estate and they're going to deal with her. But Wolf Bond, who took care of her first shop, who was a horse thief and not a very nice person, she had given him a lot of gifts, so he saddles up a horse and he rushes out and warns Reuben and Risha that the mob is coming. Well, Reuben wants to leave. Let's leave. Let's flee. And she said, no, she's not leaving her estate. He can flee, but she's going to defend the estate. So he does, and she thinks, well, he's a coward, you know. But she remains to defend the estate. And she goes out and she gathers up the peasants and tells them to get their axes and their scythes and their knives and help defend her against this terrible mob coming. And the mob comes and she takes a stand on the hill at the estate there and has the peasants there, and she has a knife and a broad blade, I believe. The estate dogs, they run out and they start growling and barking amongst these people that have come, and the rabbi sees that bloodshed will soon occur, and he orders his flock to disperse and go home. But the tough men in the group refuse the rabbi, and they stay. So then Risha taunts them with her unholy deeds. She tells them what she's done. She renounces her Jewish faith. She says she's going to join the Christian faith. And so the men then do get frightened because they feel that a converted Jew becomes very much an enemy of the Jewish people. And they become afraid of the Christians, and they disperse. Well, Reb Phallic, old, and he doesn't hear too good now, and he doesn't get around too good. He's in the study. He sees none of this. He hears none of this. But Risha rushes in with the knife in her hand, screaming for him to go. She doesn't need a Jewish synagogue there. Go to your Jews, she says. And he sees her, and he gets up and collapses on the floor and dies. So now she takes and sends his body to the Jews. And even more insulting, she sends his body with no linen for a shroud. She joins the Christian religion, She opens up her shops in the city again, and she sells to the Gentiles. But she finds that she's not really having any fun. She misses Reuben, because she misses their lascivious talk. She misses Reb Phallic, because she has no one to pity, to mock, and to betray. And then she starts having nightmares about slaughtered animals, taunting her, and pigs shoving their snouts in her face, and the bulls goring her, and Reb Phallic coming, his ghost coming and accusing her of defiling his house. And at that point, she cries out for God to punish her, but she doesn't repent in the least. She only wants the punishment. In the last part, Lashkev is terrified suddenly by a carnivorous animal attacking the people at night, biting people. And so the butchers get together and they decide to stand watch with axes and knives, and they're going to catch this animal. This animal's chasing children down the street, attacking people, defecating on the butcher's blocks, throwing out the bread that's left rising for the next day, and doing all of these things. And they're going to catch this animal, or they're going to kill it. So they're out on watch one night, and they hear one of the villagers scream. And he runs up and he says he's been bitten. And so the men pursue this animal. But some of the men, as they hear the animal hollering and screaming and yelling, they fall back. But a few keep going. And as they get closer, one of the hunters throws his axe and evidently hits the animal. The animal screams and howls and curses in Polish and Yiddish. And the men run home because they're convinced they've wounded a she-devil. And they're afraid. And the animal lays outside all night, crawls up to a house, and it howls and it curses and it yells all night until finally it's quiet. Well, then the next morning some brave people come out and they find Risha, dressed in a skunk fur coat with an axe in her back, blood. The dogs have eaten her entrails already, and realize that she was the carnivorous animal. The Jews won't bury her in their graveyard. The Christians don't want to bury her in their graveyard. So they take Risha and they bury her on the hill that she made her stand. And years later, Reuben returns to Lashkev in his old age after he's wandered, he's repented, he's eaten no meat all this time. He calls for the rabbi and the elders, and the rabbi, he tells them his sins, and he tells them even more than they knew about what Risha and he had done. And the rabbi cites confession with him. Risha's grave, meantime, becomes a garbage dump. And once a year, on the 33rd day of Omer, the schoolboys dance on, they go out with their bows and arrows. This evidently is a tradition, of some sort. They go out with their bows and arrows, but they go to the hill and they dance on the hill, and they sing songs about Risha. And then they spit on her grave afterwards. They sing, Risha slaughtered black horses, now she's falling to even evil forces. A pig for an ox, so Risha the witch, now she's roasting in sulfur and pitch. Then they spit on the grave, and after they spit on the grave, they recite, Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live thou shalt not suffer. Suffer a witch to live, thou shalt not. So Risha has gotten her comeuppance at this point, believe me. Couple of things. This I think was a parable. The narrator was omniscient. Rhetorical device. I don't know if this is a rhetorical device or not, but it was certainly a device for Singer. He introduces the story, parts of the story, and moves the story with moral, proverb, or biblical sayings. In the beginning of the story, at the very beginning, he says, the Kabbalists know that the passion for blood and the passion for flesh have the same origin, and this is the reason thou shalt not kill is followed by thou shalt not commit adultery. In other words, passion for blood and passion for the flesh are the same. Then Reb Felix's marriage. In the morning sow thy seed, and in the evening withhold not thy hand, from Ecclesiastes. Risha's slaughtering. One transgression begets another. Passion leads to greater sin and deceit. Part 4. Heaven and earth have sworn together that no secret can remain undivulged. It's a proverb. This is Risha and Reuben are found out. The key symbols. Blood represents passion. Slaughter represents the fallen state of man and the fact that Adam and Eve were vegetarians. Style of, oh, I'm sorry, I've already done that. Memorable quotes, I think, are, they say slaughterers are destined to be born murderers, but become slaughterers instead. This is one of the things Risha says to Reuben. Then the other one, she was far from repenting, but something inside her was mourning and filling her with bitterness. Opening a window, she would look out into the midnight sky full of stars and cry out, God, come and punish me. Come, Satan, come, Asmodeus. Show your might. Carry me to the burning desert behind the dark mountains. But she didn't repent. She only wanted the punishment. And I think these two things sort of sum up the character of Risha. Criticisms. Edward Alexander said, women often figure in Singer stories as embodiments of the sensual principle which distracts men from the life of piety or the life of intellect. Nowhere in Singer's fiction is the perversion to which sexuality is liable and the grotesque forms of which all life is capable expressed with more force than in the story Blood. J. Hallio says, the conflicts between sacred and profane modes of existence inform a great deal of Singer's fiction. So does the intermingling of fantasy and reality that springs from the folk tales and folklore of the humble Jews Singer most often writes about as they struggle with mundane existence, an existence enlivened by superstition, vivid dreams and ghosts, debooks, and demons, either imagined or real. Singer's straightforward, unembroidered style, as translated from Yiddish into English, conveys these extraordinary imaginings in such a way that they invariably disarm disbelief and captivate the reader's sense of actuality. For example, the horrendous events of the story Blood end with the representation of an utterly desolate and sinful woman as a werewolf. Incredible as Risha's transformation might otherwise seem, the course of her life makes this not only a just and proper outcome, but an almost inevitable one as well. In the speech that was given when he was presented with the Nobel Prize, Professor Lars Gyllensten of the Swedish Academy stated, well, I won't put that there, said about Satan and Gorai, these people are not wholly evil, not wholly good. They are haunted and harassed by things over which they have no control, by the force of circumstances, and by their own passions. Something alien, but also very close. This is typical of Singer's view of humanity, the power and fickle inventiveness of obsession, the destructive but also inflaming and creative potential of the emotions and their grotesque wealth of variation. The passions can be of the most varied kinds, often sexual, but also fanatical hopes and dreams, the figments of terror, the lure of lust or power, the nightmares of anguish. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. West. The time you've expended in preparing for Blood, in outlining the story, in defining its main characteristics will serve you well as you begin to proceed into a research paper. The nature of blood is so violent, the deception of the people, the disruption of ritual slaughter, the distortion of the slaughtering purity, and the sexual impulse that destroys the lives of Reuben, who becomes a wanderer, and Elisha, who becomes a werewolf. Again, a transmogrification possible in the types of stories Singer writes, indicates the vitality, the vibrancy, and the uniqueness of Singer's writing. Two stories I'd like to mention just very briefly because they're both part of our study. One is The Mirror. The Mirror is rather a compulsive story. It deals with a woman who loves to look at a mirror. The story, however, is told by an imp, a devilish imp, who sits in that mirror, and he's bent on stealing the spirit of this woman from her family. And he says, I have discovered such a woman in the village of Krashnik. Her father dealt in timber. And she loved to go to this mirror, and not only to go to this mirror, but to undress in front of it and to sit naked before it. She looks in the mirror and says, how beautiful I am. But then she sees in the mirror this imp. And there he is one summer, as she was staring at the nipple on her left breast. She caught sight of me in the mirror. This is the imp talking. There I was, black as tar, long as a shovel, with donkey's ears, ram's horns, a frog's mouth, and a goat's beard. My eyes were all pupil. She was so surprised she forgot to be frightened. Instead of crying, "Hear, O Israel," she burst out laughing. My, how ugly you are. And he begins to insinuate himself upon her. He begins to talk to her. He begins to lure her. He tells her his history. And slowly he plays on her. But she won't join him. At first she says, my mother didn't bring me up to be a devil's whore. He says, I'll go then. For 7 days, Zero, the woman, sat in her boudoir. And the imp says, I dozed inside the mirror. He dozed inside the mirror, luring her because of her vanity and because of her beauty and because of her lust. And finally, she decides she may be going with this imp to Never Never Land. He says, I was at Rahab, the harlot's palace, in the garden of the golden birds, near the castle of Asmodeus. As far as that, come, we'll fly together. But I don't have a thing to wear, she says. No one dresses there. Finally, she does enter the mirror. And it's done very subtly. At the end of section 2, she wishes to ask questions of me, the imp says, to catch me in contradictions, but I made off. She pressed her lips against the mirror and met the end of my tail. And she swept in to this world of Asmodeus, into this world of devilry, and no one sees her again from her family. Her father wept. Her husband tore his hair. And what kind of world? We know the world she's left. What kind of world has she entered? It's a world very much like the cave of spleen in the rape of the lock, where people meet odd things happening in the underworld. And here is Singer saying, 2 turtles are locked in embrace. A male stone mounted a female stone. Shabiri and Bariri both wanted this woman. Both want her to be her lover. But when Lilith finds out who she is, Lilith only says, let her suffer. What's wrong with a bitch, she asked. Why all the screaming? They're working on her. And Zeril is taken into the world of Asmodeus, the world of black magic, the world of suffering, lured by the imp into this infinite world of demonology where she'll find no peace through eternity. Who is Asmodeus? If you remember, mythology tells us in Solomon's clavicle that Asmodeus was a satanic figure who gave King Solomon the book of black magic so that Solomon knew all the tricks of the trade and all the world of demonology as well as the wisdom of the fathers. We're going to now move into another story from the diary of one not born. How does one... We know of one story in literature where a man wasn't born. Remember Macduff when he faced Macbeth? That was a trick. He said, I was ripped from my mother's womb in a cesarean section. I wasn't born. Now we'll see what happens in Singer's parlance when we discover a narrator who has never been born. And Miss Yelena Mayer is going to discuss the diary of one not born.
Good evening. I'm probably going to sound redundant, but here it is. This is a little bit of facts about Isaac Singer. He was born in 1904 and died in 91. His work was influenced by his older brother, Israel Joshua Singer, and he was also influenced by work of Edgar Allan Poe, Dostoevsky, and Spinoza. From the Diary of One Not Born first appeared in Partisan Review and was later published in 1957 in the collection of short stories named Gimple the Fool by Noonday Press. In 1978, he won the Nobel Prize. I'm sorry, no one can hear me. Major characters in the story. The devil, who is also a narrator of the story, he's born from the spilled seed of a yeshiva student, which is seen of Onan. Reb Paltiel, a Jewish landowner who becomes impoverished. Gran Pesh, which is his wife. Reb Getz, Green Pesh's wealthy brother who lives in Warsaw. The maiden, she's in her 30s and has a cookie baking business. Also, before I start talking about the story, I wanted to show you the mystical and biblical figures. And they're all on the screen. Should I read them? Or okay. Asmodeus is a demon who killed 7 husbands of Sarah, the daughter of Raguel, on their wedding night. One of the 7 evil spirits. Lilith is female archdemon. She was destined to be Adam's first wife, but she quarreled with him and flew away. In 13th century Kabbalistic literature, she is known as the spouse of Samael, the prince of demons. Onan, son of Judah and the Canaanite Shua. Judah commanded Onan to take Tamar, the widow of Er, in a levirate marriage. Onan withdrew during the intercourse with Tamar, and Yahweh killed him because of the evil which he has done. Kabbalah is a system of occult theosophy or mystical interpretation of the scriptures. Maklas, or Malka, that's as close as I could get to that, is king or God the king. Namach, on Mar, is a translation which is hasty, rush, or reckless. And Black Mountains is residence of devil. Okay. The story is the first-person memoir of a devil born from a drop of spilled semen who proudly recounts his highlights of his career as a tempter and malefactor. The story contains two parts. In the first part, he presents his adolescent years, and in the second part, his full-grown adult devil. Before I start summarizing the two parts, I wanted to talk about this kind of sentences. They're not really grammatical sentences that precede both of the parts. They are incomplete sentences, but they seem to be so poetic, and they sound like almost like chants if you read them. Where the man does not walk, where cattle does not tread, Friday the 13th of the 13th month, between day and night, behind the black mountains, in the wasted woodland, at the castle of Asmodeus, by the light of a charmed moon. They provide a sense of something mystical, something poetic. They fit the story of the devil. They are sort of saying that the first part is saying that here's how it began, and the second one is saying that here's the conclusion, and something like long live the devil, because it does end in such a way. The first lines tell us about the kingdom of devil, black mountains, and the devil itself, Asmodeus. Okay, and after those parts, he starts the story itself. The author of the story, as I already said, is a devil. He was born from the sin of Onan, and he has devil-like appearance. He is horned like a buck and winged like a bat, with the mind of a scholar and the heart of a highwayman. And in this passage, we can almost hear him saying in his cunning and murmurous voice, I was created half spirit, half demon, half air, half shade, horned like a buck and winged like a bat. I am and I am not. I whistle down chimneys and then the public bath. And that's how he starts enumerating his evil deeds. He overturns the pot of Sabbath food in the poor man's kitchen. He makes a woman unclean when her husband returns from a trip. He ruins a young rabbi's first sermon on the great Sabbath before the Passover. He turns into a fly and bits the tip of Rabbi's nose, which distracts the rabbi, and Rabbi, trying to get rid of this fly, can't pay attention to his prayers or anything, and his reputation is ruined, or shaken at least. His wife attacks him for his poor performance, and they have a terrible quarrel. The narrator, which is the devil, watches women take ritual baths, which is kind of almost like a sin. He gets into the bedroom and listens to forbidden talk between man and wife. He reads people letters. He counts saved money in women's nest eggs. He can hear people's thoughts, and he listens to them. And although he doesn't need any money, he still enjoys small thieveries. He steals pins from women's dresses, and that loosens their bows and knots. He hides important papers and wills. And then we read about, there's a more detailed description of his accomplishments. He talks about Reb Paltriel, a gentleman from distinguished family and charitable nature. He's a Jewish landowner. He becomes impoverished. His land and his cattle failed, and he can't support himself and his family. So Reb decides that his luck has turned, and he finds comfort in reading the Talmud. He decides that he'll eat as long as he has something to eat, and if that runs out, he'll go begging. Well, his wife, upon learning that, she starts begging her husband to go see her rich brother. She says, what's the use of sitting here and waiting till everything runs out? Go ask him for money. And eventually the husband gives in and goes there. But I wanted to read something before we go. The reason he didn't want to go there was because he was let's see. Her husband was a proud man. That's on the page 137. Her husband was a proud man, however, and he replied, I don't want any favors from anyone. If it is God's will that I be provided for, he will give me from his full hand. And if it is my fate to be a pauper, this trip will be needless self-abasement. Anyway, he seems to accept the fact that he's poor now, and he feels fine with it, but his wife talks him into this journey. And the journey is not pleasant in itself. It takes him a while. He's exhausted. He's worn out, but he gets the money, makes his way home, and he comes in the house, and his wife is sitting by the fire. She greets him, and she says that she expected 1,000 guldens, I believe, golden notes, but whatever he gave us, and if it's 500, that's good. And writing these words, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that the devil is present throughout the whole journey, being as a flea in his beard. So when he hears these words, he jumps right at her nose, at his wife's nose, with such force that she drops the money into the fire, and it burns in seconds. Therefore, the situation is back where it started. They're poor, and they're in bad luck again. So Reb is forced to go begging. He comes back to what he wanted to do by his own will. For this deed, the devil receives warm congratulations from Asmodeus and Lilith. And then we hear the second part, which is a story of him as a grown-up, full-grown devil, and a male in that. He's now at his prime. He says that his demonic powers could be driven off by a holy spell, but for that, one needs to possess knowledge of Kabbalah. And since no one has that knowledge of Kabbalah, he's pretty much can do whatever he pleases to. The first incident happens at night when the devil turns himself into a sack of salt and lies on the roadside. A man passing by sees the sack. He picks it up, he puts it in his wagon, and he wants to know what that is. He opens the mouth of the, let's see, I'm going to read from that. It's page 140. As soon as I was in the wagon, he opened the mouth of the sack and took a lick. Evidently, he wanted to find out whether I was salt or sugar. In a second, I had become a calf, and I'll give you 3 guesses where he was licking me. When he saw what he was doing, the poor wretch nearly went crazy. His hands and feet began to tremble. What's going on here, he cried. Where the devil am I? Suddenly, I flipped my wings and flew away like an eagle. The drayman arrived home a sick man. And the second one, a lengthy description of his second deed. It's about a maiden in her 30s who supports herself by baking cookies for yeshiva students. The devil just passes by the village. He sees the windows and he smells the cookies, and he decides to marry the woman. The village collects a dowry for her, and since she's the virgin, they build the wedding canopy in the synagogue court. When they get into the bed, he first starts talking about his first wife and a holy promise that he has given her to never marry again. And that's not exactly pleasing for his bride. And then he starts to play tricks on her. He tells her to draw closer to him so he can whisper her something in her ear. And then he spits in her ear. She totally confused, and she doesn't understand what's going on. And she turns around and wants to go to bed, to sleep. And then he pinches her behind. He drives her crazy, and finally, on page 143, and finally she begins to weep hoarsely, as can only a friendless orphan who has waited over 30 years for her lucky day and then finds herself exposed to a monster. And the monster he is. Next morning, he goes to Rabbi and tells him that his newly wife is a whore. She's not a virgin. The town is startled. They obviously have no clue what's going on, but the women get together and start to investigate. They go see the bed. No signs of blood there. The wife cries. She swears that they didn't have nothing happened, they didn't have sex, so how could he know that she's not a virgin? But no one believes her. Her reputation is already ruined. And her business is ruined too, because he says that whoever heard of a town letting a girl stay unmarried until she's over 30 and having her bake cookies for the yeshiva students? That's page 144. So they're thinking, contemplating about getting a doctor to make sure that she is a virgin or not, but they never get to actually getting one. So Rabbi tells him to divorce her and just, let it go, find yourself another wife. But devil is not just interested in divorcing her, he wants her money as well. She obviously had some money saved, and that's about, he asked for 100 and she has 70, so he says, well, go sell your gifts. Which is, then the girl shrieks, take everything, tear out my insides, and that's exactly what he does. By the time they decide to get a divorce and the scribe sits down to write the divorce paper, he disappears. And he leaves her without the divorce, and she can never marry again. According to Jewish religion, that one has to be divorced or the spouse has to be deceased for a woman to get married. So she's left disembodied and miserable, and she finally commits suicide. And when he goes back to the Black Mountains, Asmodeus himself praised my little job. That's what he calls it, his little job. Not bad, he said, you are on the way. And he sent me to Maklach, the daughter of Nama, the she-devil who teaches young demons the paths of corruption. I had trouble locating critical articles or books on this particular one, so I'm just going to tell you that to conclude this story, I wanted to say that it's deep in mythology and that it shows us devil at his work. And it's an omniscience demon. He's everywhere, and that's what the second part tells us when we read that grammatically incomplete sentence. It's on page 140, where the heavens are copper and the earth iron, on a field of toadstools, in a ruined outhouse, on a dung heap, in a pot without a bottom, on a Sabbath night during the winter solstice, not to be thought of now, nor later, nor at night. Amen, Salah. So we should be aware of that. And he also tells us that bad things happen with no particular reason to good people, to bad people, and that could be an explanation. An explanation for the way things are, and that could be the way to understand the world. He uses, a singer employs such devices as grotesque and sarcasm. When he calls Reb Getz, which is a brother of Grand Pesh, Warsaw crosses, that refers to Greek mythology, and that's basically saying that he's filthy rich, and that's how he calls him. That's all I have.
Thank you. Again, a story of deception, a story of demonic victory, a story of innocent people who are degraded, defiled, who are ruined, whose reputations are ruined, and Singer tells us that's the way of the world. He doesn't have to look very far to find people who have experienced these traumas. Ms. Meyer said that she hasn't been able to find certain sources. But when you study Singer, the sources become almost apparent depending on where you're looking. If you look, for example, at the prophet Habakkuk in the Hebrew Scriptures, you'll discover that there are prophecies. Habakkuk, in fact, rails against people who commit certain sins. What are those sins? He rails against borrowers who deceive creditors. He rails against those who use others for their own ends. You would find plenty of that evidence in The Wife Killer. You would find evidence of that sort from A Diary of One Not Born. He rails against those who commit crimes. Well, the devil has inspired, the evil spirit has inspired Elka. The evil spirit has inspired Risha. The evil spirit has himself run these women to ruin. Habakkuk rails against those who are drunk and sexually depraved. And certainly in the mirror, you can see why the woman was lured by the imp into the nether world. And he rails against those who follow idols, and the idols may be modern sources they wouldn't approve of at all. That is modern devices, modern governments, modern routines, modern habits. So if you want to find in Isaac Singer's works biblical sources, you can. He's as well read in the Bible as he is well read in secular sources such as the stories of Edgar Allan Poe, and certainly he is well read in the demonological literature known as the Zohar, or identified in the Zohar. There's a story I'd like to end with, which is a rather unique story, and we don't have much time to look at it. But the story originally appeared in the New Yorker magazine on, let's see, I've got the date someplace here. It originally appeared in the New Yorker magazine December 20th, 1976. It was republished in a set of stories called Old Age, and then it was republished in another magazine, another book called In Another Part of the Forest, an anthology of gay short fiction. In this particular book, the story too tells of, in this story, that we learn of two rabbinical students, one Ezriel and one Zissel. Zissel has been, his parents originally wanted a daughter, but much to the dismay, they had a son. He grew up, however, with effeminate desires, effeminate needs, and when at the age of 15 people proposed marriage for him and brought marriage partners, he rejected them. However, he met another rabbinical student, Ezriel, an older student, and they formed a study bond together. Then when Ezriel married, so did Zissel. But when they married, they discovered that their wives were less desirable to them than they were to each other. So they abandoned their wives, moved to Lublin, where Ezriel became a rabbinical scholar, and Zissel became, in disguise of a woman, the attendant to the public bath. And for years, the women attending this public bath, attending the mikvah, there for purification, there for ritualistic purposes, told all their closest secrets to Zissel. But when a bride, a 17-year-old, comes to the ritual bath, Zissel discovers his masculine powers aroused. And he makes sure that this girl comes back to the ritual bath at night, where aroused, he lunges for her, and they both fall backwards into the ritual bath and drown. An amazing discovery. But this points to another piece of knowledge in Singer's repertoire, and that's the myth of the red heifer, where, according to the scholarly books, according to the deepest religious interpretations, a red heifer without a spot without a blemish, who never came under a yoke, is sacrificed to restore and to repair the sins of the people. And here we have a woman who's been married, but who is still pure, who is undefiled, who arouses Zissel's masculine desires. And when they fall back together again into the water and drown, she has brought Zissel back to his masculinity. And though she has died for his sins as the red heifer dies for its to repair man's sins, she removes this taint of homosexuality, which in Singer's mind is not a desirable thing. Singer gives us all kinds of impressions, leads us good and evil, and helps us understand the way of the world.